Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Melbourne Traditionalist episode 72. Today, I'm going to talk about Afghanistan. Now, we've been involved in Afghanistan since 2001, so we're nearly at the 20-year mark. But what most people don't know is how Afghanistan got to the point where it seems to have been constantly at war. One thing that you'll often hear about war zones is, they've been fighting there for centuries, which pretty much describes everywhere in the world if you're going to stretch it to that level. Most places in the world actually have periods where they're very heavily involved in conflict and other times when they're very, very peaceful. And Afghanistan's history is very much like that. Now, really, what I want to concentrate on is the end of the monarchy. Afghanistan was an absolute monarchy until 1973, and then it was overthrown. And so I'll look at why it was overthrown and what it was replaced with, and why that led to the constant war and instability that we are now experiencing and have experienced for decades. Afghanistan is an ancient land with a long and complex history, but Afghanistan, as you and I think of it, didn't exist until the 1700s. From 1709, an Afghan empire began to be created, and it's from this date that modern Afghanistan can said to have begun. It was quite powerful at that time. It had a large empire which occupied much of what's now Afghanistan, Pakistan, and areas of northern India. In 1761, it fought and won the Battle of Panipat, which was fought about 100 kilometres north of Delhi. After that, its power declined, and during the 1800s, it became like Persia, Tibet, and to a lesser extent China, a buffer zone between the British and Russian empires. It fought 3 wars against the British empires: the First, Second and Third Afghan Wars, the last in 1919, which was its only foreign war in the entire 20th century. And even internally, it was mostly peaceful. It did not fight in either World War I or World War II, and remained non-aligned during the Cold War, even though it had a border with the Soviet Union. After the Third Afghan War of 1919, King Ahmadullah Khan declared Afghanistan a sovereign and fully independent state. He moved to end his country's traditional isolation by establishing diplomatic relations with the international community, and following a 1927-28 tour of Europe and Turkey, introduced several reforms intended to modernise his nation. A key force behind these reforms was Mahmud Tazi, an ardent supporter of the education of women. He fought for Article 68 of Afghanistan's 1923 constitution, which made elementary education compulsory and abolished the institution of slavery. Some of the reforms that were put in place, such as the abolition of the traditional burqa for women and the opening of a number of co-educational schools, quickly alienated many tribal and religious leaders. Faced with overwhelming armed opposition, Ahmadullah Khan was forced to abdicate in January 1929 after Kabul, the capital, fell to rebel forces. Prince Muhammad Nader Shah, Ahmadullah's cousin, in turn defeated the rebels in November 1929 and was declared King Nader Shah. He abandoned the reforms of Ahmadullah Khan in favour of a more gradual approach to modernisation, but that didn't do him much good because he was assassinated in 1933. His son, Muhammad Zahir Khan, was 19 years old, and he succeeded to the throne and reigned from 1933 to 1973. Until 1946, Zahir Shah ruled with the assistance of his uncle, who held the post of Prime Minister, and continued the policies of Nader Shah, his father. Another of Zahir Shah's uncles, Shah Mahmud Khan, became Prime Minister in 1946, and began an experiment allowing greater political freedom, but reversed the policy when it went further than he expected. He was replaced in 1953 by Muhammad Daoud Khan, the king's cousin and brother-in-law. Daoud Khan sought a closer relationship with the Soviet Union and a more distant one towards Pakistan. The Daoud supported a nationalistic reunification of the Pashtun people. The Pashtun people are the majority of people in Afghanistan and Pakistan, but as I said, majority. There are a lot of minorities in both countries, and that created a lot of problems. Because to reunite the Pashtun people would have meant that most of Pakistan and most of Afghanistan, but not all of them, would have been separated from the nation. There was a proposal in the 1950s for Afghanistan and Pakistan to become a confederation, but that didn't go anywhere. And the move worried the non-Pashtun populations of both countries, such as the Tajiks and Uzbeks, who suspected Daoud Khan's intention was to increase the Pashtuns' disproportionate hold on political power. In 1961, as a result of Daoud's policy and support to militias in areas along the Pakistan border, Pakistan closed its border with Afghanistan, causing an economic crisis which forced it to become more dependent upon the Soviet Union. The Soviets became Afghanistan's principal trading partner, and within a few months of the Pakistani border closures, the Soviets sent aircraft, tanks, and artillery to Afghanistan for a heavily discounted price. The crisis was finally resolved with the forced resignation of Daoud Khan in March 1963 and the reopening of the border in May of that year. Pakistan continued to remain suspicious of Afghan intentions, and Daoud's policy had left a negative impression in the eyes of many Tajiks who felt they were being disenfranchised for the sake of Pashtun nationalism. Daoud Khan was not a supporter of the king. In 1973, when King Zahir Shah was away in Italy for eye surgery, Daoud Khan led a coup d'etat in which 8 people were killed. This resulted in the overthrow of the king and the abolition of the monarchy. Daoud established a new government and declared himself the first president of Afghanistan. The Arg Palace in Kabul then became the official presidential residence, and Zahir Shah lived in exile in Italy. Now it should be remembered that Daoud Khan was the king's cousin and brother-in-law. This was possible because Daoud Khan, the coup, was popular with officers in the army. They were embarrassed by the backwardness of Afghanistan. They did not want a military dictatorship. They did not want to run the country. They simply wanted to not be embarrassed. So they looked for other groups who were happy with the overthrow of the king, and they found the PDPA, or the People's Democratic Party of Afghanistan, or as everyone called it, the Afghan Communist Party. Neither Daoud Khan or the officer corps were communists, but they were desperate for support as the 1973 revolution was very unpopular. Daoud Khan renewed his conflict with Pakistan. He began sending men into Pakistan to carry out sabotage and to create strife. Internally, his government came to rely more and more on the communists, and they encouraged close relationships with the Soviets, which encouraged those who were unhappy with the overthrow of the king to begin resisting the government, which in turn encouraged the communists to increase their efforts to take control of the government. Daoud Khan began to have doubts about both the Soviets and the PDPA, doubts which started after the overthrow of the Ethiopian Emperor Haile Selassie in 1974 by the communists. His plan was to replace Soviet aid with aid from the Arab world. In that vein, he signed an agreement with Egypt to help train the Afghan army. This upset the Soviets, who were the biggest supporters of his government, and it set in motion what's called the Zahir Revolution. On the 18th of April 1978, so 5 years after the overthrow of the king, a funeral took place of a senior member of the PDPA, who many in the PDPA believed had been murdered by the government. It's never been established whether that's true or not. After the funeral, thousands gathered to hear anti-government speeches. In retaliation, Zahir Khan ordered that the senior leadership of the PDPA be arrested, but it took too long, and they used their support within the Afghan army to launch a coup on the 27th of April. The coup was strategically planned to begin on Thursday, the 27th of April, because it was the day before Friday, the Muslim day of worship, and most military commanders and government workers were off duty. With the help of a few aeroplanes of Afghanistan's Air Force, which were mainly Soviet-made MiG-21 and Su-7s, the insurgent troops overcame the resistance of the Presidential Guard. Zahir Khan and most of his family were killed and buried in unmarked graves. Afghanistan had gone from an absolute monarchy to having a communist government in 5 years. Within the PDPA, there were two major factions, the Clique and the Parcham. The Clique were quite radical and thought of the Soviets as not radical enough. The Parcham was very pro-Soviet. In 1978, the Chuk faction was in control, and now that they had power, they pushed for rapid modernization. They planned to make Afghanistan a modern state, which to them meant a communist state, by 1983. That's within 5 years. The new president was Nur Muhammad Taraki. Now that they were in power, the party implemented a new socialist agenda, including the promotion of state atheism. It changed the national flag from the traditional Islamic green colour to a near copy of the red flag of the Soviet Union, a provocative affront to the people of this conservative Islamic country. The regime abolished Muslim laws and encouraged men to cut off their beards, and women were banned from wearing the burqa. These sorts of laws were considered to contravene Islam by many of the nation's conservatives. Most of the mosques were placed off limits at the start of the regime. Land reform was implemented, but it was without compensation, and usury laws, which were designed to stop poor farmers from becoming debt slaves, failed, because now poor farmers couldn't get money to buy food or tools or seeds or labour. What the communists did was they basically decided these things were wrong and they abolished them, and they put no plan in place to replace them. So that led to a fall in food production of around 1/3. So people actually started to go hungry because of the government's policies. At the same time, they began arresting, torturing, and executing those who opposed the new policies, which included a lot of mullahs or religious leaders. At least 10,000 and maybe as many as 27,000 were executed in 2 years. Now, Afghanistan was a backwards country, but mass executions didn't happen there. Mass arrests didn't happen there because the government wasn't powerful enough, and it never tried to be that powerful. And it was a monarchy. Monarchies don't do those kinds of things, but communist governments do. All of this led to armed rebellion and the loss of most of the countryside to the government. The army had remained loyal to the new government, but that didn't stop it from being purged. In 1978, there were about 8,000 officers. 2 years later, there were about 1,100. The army went from around 90,000 to 20,000 in the same time period. The policies of the Clique faction were leading to ruin. The government, the army, and the entire country were falling apart. In February 1979, The contentious law and order situation led to a serious diplomatic incident involving the United States, the Soviet Union, and Afghanistan, when the US ambassador to Afghanistan, Adolf Spike Dubs, was kidnapped by a mysterious group of militants. Even today, we're not sure who they were. They are sometimes alleged to have been part of a radical communist faction known as National Oppression, but they're also sometimes described as Islamists. Well, communists aren't Islamists, and Islamists aren't communists. The National Oppression reportedly demanded the release of their communist leader, whom the Afghan government denied holding. The government refused categorically to negotiate with the militants in spite of the US Embassy's demands. The US increased pressure on the Afghan government and the Soviet Union, forcibly demanding peaceful negotiations for the release of their ambassador. Dobbs was held in room 117 of the Kabul Hotel, where the United States sent its embassy and diplomatic staff to negotiate with the communist faction, if they were communists. The Afghan security forces, accompanied by their Soviet advisors, swarmed the hallways and surrounding rooftops of the hotel. When negotiations stalled, there was an intense exchange of gunfire after Russian advisors ordered an assault. US Ambassador Adolf Dobbs was caught in the crossfire, leading to his death. Afterwards, the United States formally expressed to the Soviet Union its disapproval of the assault by the security forces, which put a lot more pressure on US-Soviet relations. And 1979 was a particularly bad year for that. And I think you can agree that the killing of a US ambassador did not improve things. In September 1979, the organizer of the Tsar Revolution, Hazullah Amin, organized a new coup, this time putting himself into power. And while he tried to soften the blow, he continued on the same course. President Taraki, who he had replaced, disappeared, and it's widely believed that he was smothered to death with a pillow. As this was going on, the Soviets were becoming more and more involved in Afghanistan. More technical advisors, more military advisors, more money, more equipment, more influence. Things were going so badly that the Afghan government asked the Soviets to send in regiments of Soviet soldiers. But the Soviets were falling into the same trap that the Americans fell into in Vietnam. They came to believe that the local people were stupid and incompetent, and that they were not stupid and they were not incompetent, and that they could succeed where the locals could not. So the Soviets decided to intervene in Afghanistan, but in a much greater way than the Afghans had asked for. So on the 27th of December 1979, the Soviets sent 80,000 troops into Afghanistan, most of them on that day. President Amin knew that they were coming. He'd been told, and he was happy. When Afghan intelligence told him that the Soviets were going to topple him, he didn't believe it. That night, the Soviets stormed the palace and killed him and his family, and installed a Pacham faction leader as president, Babram Kamal. In the West, this was known as the invasion of Afghanistan, and certainly the Soviets carried it out as if it was an invasion. They made sure that the Afghans could not stop their takeover of the country. And they also assaulted the presidential palace and killed the president of Afghanistan. Now, that they actually managed to keep secret for about 15 years. And everyone believed that he had been killed by fellow Afghans, but that had not been the case. Now that the Soviets were so involved in Afghanistan, they wanted to make sure that there was no comeback. And the Soviets now encouraged a more moderate policy, but actually their mere presence meant that everything now, which was already escalating out of control, just became even crazier, because of course people notice when there's a foreign army in their country, and the Afghans certainly did. Now I'm going to leave it there, and I'm going to continue this next week, I hope. So I hope you've enjoyed this, and I will speak to you again. Bye bye.